When people speak about the atomic bomb today, the conversation almost always begins with the same headline. It ended the war. But history has never been that simple. Wars do not end with a single explosion, and nations do not make decisions of that scale for only one reason. When the Enola Gay lifted off from Tinian Island on August 6, 1945, it carried more than a weapon. It carried a message, and not all of it was addressed to Japan. By the summer of 45, Japan was bleeding out. The empire that once stretched across the Pacific now clung to islands like a drowning man holds a piece of driftwood. Millions were dead. Cities were ash and shadow. The Imperial Navy was a graveyard, yet the fanatical resolve of its leadership showed no cracks. The word surrender was poison, spoken only by those considered already dead. But here's the uncomfortable truth no one teaching high school history likes to say aloud. Japan was already searching for a way out, just not through Washington. Tokyo was secretly communicating through Moscow, hoping Stalin would negotiate terms that allowed them to save face, avoid occupation, and keep the emperor. The Americans knew this. They were decoding cables through the magic intercepts. To them, the path was obvious. If Japan surrendered through Stalin, then Joseph Vissarionovich would walk into the peace process like a welcomed guest and walk out with half of Asia in his pocket. And in Washington, that prospect was colder than any nuclear blast. Because just as the war with Germany was ending, another race was beginning, not on battlefields, but in the minds of men who sat in smoky rooms with maps and cigars. Truman, Churchill, and Stalin were carving up the aftermath before the ashes settled. The atomic bomb did not enter that conversation as a weapon. It entered as leverage. Historians on one side argue that America's hand was forced. A bloody invasion of the Japanese home islands threatened 1 million Allied casualties and countless Japanese civilians. But others, reading diary entries and diplomatic memos, see something more calculated. The bomb ended one war while announcing the beginning of another, because the shock wave that rolled across Hiroshima did not stop at city limits. It rolled across tables in the Kremlin. It told Stalin, without a meeting, without a treaty, without the courtesy of a whisper, that the United States had stepped into a new century of power, and everyone else was still living in the old one. If Germany's V-2 rockets were the weapon of tomorrow, then the atomic bomb was the weapon that rewrote tomorrow itself. For Japan, it meant devastation. For the military planners of the world, it meant panic masked as calculation. For Stalin, it meant something far more unsettling. The balance of fear had shifted, and he no longer sat in the center. And yet, even now, generations later, the question lingers like radioactive dust. Was Hiroshima the price of peace, or the opening line of a global negotiation conducted in fire? Because wars do not end cleanly, they echo. And the first atomic echo did not fade. It traveled east. 3 days after Hiroshima, the world expected silence, shock, mourning, hesitation. Instead, the sky above Japan darkened again. August 9th, 1945, Nagasaki. A second sun bloomed, bright enough to carve shadows permanently into stone. Some ask why America dropped the second bomb so quickly. Was the first not message enough? Was Japan even given time to understand what had happened? But here is the detail that changes everything. The Soviet Union declared war on Japan on August 8th, the day between the two bombs. Historians who reject coincidence raise an eyebrow at that timing. Stalin had promised to enter the Pacific War 3 months after Germany surrendered. 3 months, exactly to the day, he did. But the plan in Moscow reached further than a date on a calendar. Stalin intended to seize Manchuria, Korea, Sakhalin, and possibly northern Japan itself. Soviet troops were already moving with the same unstoppable momentum that crushed Berlin. The Red Army was not coming as a friend. It was arriving as a landlord with no empty houses left in Europe. If Japan surrendered to the United States, America would rebuild it. If Japan surrendered through Stalin, Japan might never rise again. When Nagasaki disappeared under a boiling cloud, the Soviet advance didn't stop. They wanted territory, influence, ports, leverage. The bomb did not scare Moscow into retreat. It forced them into acceleration. Japan now faced a nightmare choice: surrender to the nation that had destroyed its cities, or surrender to the nation that erased nations entirely. One side offered occupation, the other offered absorption, and that leads to the most divisive question of this entire event. Did America drop the bomb to end the war, or to end Soviet ambition in the Pacific? Japan capitulated 5 days after Nagasaki. Not 3, not 2, 5. But look closely. The surrender broadcast mentions the bomb only partially. It does not mention Nagasaki by name. It mentions something else. The Soviet Union has entered the war. For some scholars, this is the moment the story flips. It wasn't just mushroom clouds that broke Japan's will. It was the realization that the empire could fall into Soviet hands. One weapon threatened death, one empire threatened erasure, and so the bombs that turned 2 cities into shadows also turned the global chessboard. The United States did not just defeat Japan. It positioned itself above every nation, ideology, and army, including the one that marched under the Red Star. The Cold War did not begin with Berlin or Korea or NATO. It began the moment Stalin looked at the sky and understood that the rules of war had changed without his permission. Because the atomic bomb did more than destroy cities. It destroyed certainty. It killed strategy. It ended the age where numbers, factories, and bodies alone decided victory. From that day on, power was defined not by soldiers, but by seconds. The time it takes for one flash to erase a city. The time it takes for a leader to decide whether to retaliate. The time between warning and annihilation, measured not in hours, but in heartbeats. Japan was the battlefield. The world was the audience. Moscow was the recipient. And the message was written in fire. Even now, after generations, the question refuses to die. Was the atomic bomb humanity's darkest shortcut to peace, or the first shot of the next war? Because the weapon that ended World War II did not end conflict. It redefined it. The bomb finished a war between nations while igniting a war between ideologies. 2 cities paid the price. The world inherited the silence that followed, a silence not of peace, but of waiting. Waiting for the next decision, waiting for the next flash, waiting to see whether that fire was the end of something or just the beginning. History only survives if someone carries it forward. If this documentary gave you something to think about, a moment, a detail, a perspective, consider subscribing. It tells the algorithm this story matters, and it tells us to keep making more.